Alright, this video is focused on the question of the outer world. Whether we can know whether what we perceive really exists. Whether the world we think is real is in fact real. So this is part of the epistemological section of the course, and epistemology is devoted to the question of knowledge. What can we know? Are there different forms of knowing? Is religious knowing on the same status or a real form of knowing versus scientific knowledge, so on and so forth. And one of the most basic questions that is asked by epistemology is, can we know anything with absolute certainty? So this was what Descartes took up. He started a project where he wanted to know if there was anything he could know with absolute certainty. And so this kind of lecture follows upon the Descartes uncertainty. And it produces or explores some different ways, some alternative ways that one could be unsure about the existence of the real world. And it also explores Descartes' response to this uncertainty and his effort to come up with one piece of knowledge that is absolutely certain. Okay, so in the Rachel's reading, Rachel's begins with this thought experiment called Vats and Demons. So essentially, it relies on a materialistic understanding of human consciousness. And a materialistic understanding of human consciousness entails that what we experience, what we think, all our thoughts, all our conscious events in our life are products of chemical reactions in the brain, chemical and electrical reactions. So essentially there's input from the outside. There is light that hits your eyes and it activates neurons in your brain and chemical reactions occur, and it is fascinating to think about the brain in that way. And that this is what we experience as consciousness. This is what our whole life is. Our memory, our sense of self, our sense of reality, our chemical reactions in the brain based upon electrical reactions, an input coming in. And the output is then our brain sending electrical signals to other parts of our body, which then follow along, obey these signals. And so we are, in a certain sense, materialistic. We're purely physical, according to this theory, and in a very, 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 very incredibly complex way, mechanical. Okay, so you got this idea, this materialistic idea, and if it were the case that this is what constituted our consciousness, this is the basis for all we think, believe, remember, feel, so on and so forth, then it is possible that our reality could be a computer-generated event. Simply some computer or some other device sends signals that activate certain parts of our brains, and these signals would be what formerly were coming from the outside, in terms of light, in terms of sound, so on and so forth. But now we are a brain in a vat. This is the thought experiment. That all we are is this brain that is put in some kind of liquid, and there's all these wires connected to it, and these wires or these devices send signals to the brain that activate the parts of our brain that correspond to sensation, or correspond to having an idea, or correspond to having an urge, or correspond to hearing a sound. And that's our reality. We don't have a real body, we're just a brain in a vat. Now, one objection immediately arises. You can say, well, this is technologically impossible. No computer is even close to being able to replicate the experience of consciousness in a brain. We know far, far, far too little about the brain, how it operates, and we know our technology is far too crude to do something like this. So it's a good objection. However, if it is true that we are a brain in the vat, perhaps the reality in the time period we experience is a product of that computer. So the computer is making us think that we live in an era where this technology is impossible, but in fact that era is long since passed, and the actual reality is that there is this technological capacity. And this is what really The Matrix builds on. And so The Matrix was a famous movie in the very late 20th century, 1999, made a lot of money. There was a trilogy. Hopefully you've seen it before this, but if not, enjoy. And really, what is interesting to us is the first half of that movie. The second half becomes more just kind of an adventure, fighting, action type of movie. But the first half is really where the philosophic questions arise. And in this movie, you see this thought experiment that were a brain in the vat kind of played out in movie form. And what happens is that it's far into the future, and there was a war between the computers, the artificial intelligence, and the human beings. And in this war, human beings blackened the earth. They burned everything. They bombed everything to darken the skies because the computers relied on solar energy. It's kind of funny that this advanced technological system relied on solar energy. But be that as it may, so they didn't have solar energy. And so they had to use human brain power to gain their electricity. And so to keep human beings alive, they created this vast computer-generated simulation that replicates the world at the time. And so these computers generate images, and we're all part of this computer-generated reality. We don't realize it, but as the story goes, one of the prisoners, in fact, eventually is tipped off and becomes suspicious and is released, and then sees that this world that he thought was real, that was his life, is in fact, again, just a complete computer-generated reality. And so it fits with this idea of the brain in the vat. It also fits, it is worth noting, quite well with Plato's cave. The idea that the reality that we think is true is in fact forced upon us, and that we are in some ways prisoners of a reality that is not our own. That is very much like Plato's cave. So too is this idea that the release is very hard, is very difficult. Is this thing you have to be pulled out of. In Plato's cave, the prisoner literally has to be kind of pulled out, dragged out of the cave, forced to confront and to see this higher reality that he thought isn't true, isn't real. And so the same thing with the movie, The Matrix. Neo has to be forced out, forced to see, and he initially rejects this new reality, this true reality, because he's so used to the old. And so, in that way they're similar, in that way in the sense that the false images that we're being, that are surrounding us, that we're immersed in, are the product of kind of these evil masters. Again, there's kind of a parallel. And so too is the parallel of the idea that the philosopher has to go back in the cave, and that the philosopher is rejected. People aren't going to want to hear or believe that the reality that they thought was real is in fact false. And the same thing, they talk about that in The Matrix, in the sense that those that are in the system will reject it, will protect it, because they think it is real, and they want their reality to continue. Okay, so there's those similarities, and I'm sure there's some others as well. So it's interesting to kind of think about that, The Matrix, in light of not only Descartes and the brain in the vat, and the kind of the evil genius, but also in light of Plato's cave. Okay, so there's another kind of very closely related theory which puts into question whether the outer world is really real, whether it really exists, and that's the notion of idealism. And in idealism, one of the core points is that what we experience, all we know about our experience is the ideas we have in our brain, the images, the perceptions that we have in our brain. We don't know for sure whether those perceptions correspond to something real, relate to something really out there in the world. That's what it seems like, but all we know for sure is what we are experiencing, and what we are experiencing could be nothing more than images and thoughts and ideas in the brain. So again, this is kind of wild and unrealistic stuff in one regard. And Descartes, to go back to kind of a previous lecture, admits that. He says, look, it is not very likely that an evil genius exists. It is not at all likely that we are part of a computer-generated reality. So these thoughts aren't based on the idea that this is true. They're based on the question of whether you can know for certain that they are not true. And that's the real challenge. Can you know with real certainty that you're not a brain in the vat, or that you're not part of the matrix computer-generated reality, or that there's not an evil genius out there tricking you, or that all these experiences are simply thoughts and ideas and experiences within one's head? And so that's idealism. George Berkley, a famous Irish bishop, was one of the proponents, one of the supporters of this idea. And he's very famous for the notion that if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, does it really fall? Because his idea is, look, we don't know whether a real world exists. All we know is our perceptions. So if nobody is there to perceive the tree falling in the forest, does it really happen? Does it exist? And ultimately he gets to the position of saying, well, there is one all-powerful perceiver. There is one being that can perceive all of reality at once, and that can order reality properly, and can make sure these perceptions are stable, and that is God. So Berkeley's response is not that necessarily an outer world exists, but this perceptual world is kept in order by God. Now, Rachel's, in the section on idealism, does list a number of objections to idealism. A number of reasons to think that what we are experiencing is in fact corresponding to a real outer world. And there's three reasons that he gives. One is the stability. Our sensations of the outside world don't change in an instant or in an unusual way. You know, if something did change in a very quick and rapid way, we'd ask why, what happened? You know, was there a fire, for example, or was there a bomb, an explosion? Was there a tsunami that wiped things out? But in the normal course of life, things are pretty stable. My room looks the same, pretty much the same every day. And if it changes, it's part of a change that I can identify. You know, maybe the paint color is changed. So it goes from this green that you see behind me to, you know, some kind of blue or some kind of red. But I would expect then that there would have been a paint job. It wouldn't have just instantaneously changed. And so there's that kind of stability in our world. That changes can be accounted for, and that the changes that do occur are not rapid, unusual, unexpected, that kind of thing. So that indicates that, look, if it was just ideas in our head, why wouldn't the world be able to change radically, quickly, abruptly? There's also the notion of concurrence, in the sense that my wife, myself, you, my kids, we tend to see roughly the same thing. You know, we may not agree, for example, again, looking at the wall behind me, that that is a particular shade of green. We may perceive the color slightly differently, but we all perceive that there's a wall there, that there is some shade of green, unless you're colorblind. But then again, there's no doubt that it's a wall and that there's some shade of color. It's just you can't identify it. And so we wouldn't disagree that there's a door behind me and so on and so forth. You know, if somebody's watching this video with you, you would both see a computer screen or a mobile device. You would see me talking. There'd be agreement. And again, if reality was just images and perceptions in our head, you wouldn't expect that type of agreement. And finally, Rachel's mentioned this idea of independent operation. So it seems like the world operates independently of us. If I turn on the dishwasher, for example, it seems to run absent me perceiving it. If I turn on a movie, for example, and then leave for 10 minutes, and I've seen that movie before, and I come back, generally it's 10 minutes after where I left it. There's that sense that the world is not dependent upon our perception, that it operates independently of us. And so all of those are, important ways that you can argue against idealism, that you can say it's not just, all a big illusion. Because there is that stability, there is that agreement, the concurrence, and there is the independent operation of the world. However, and this is again the big thing, the important thing, Descartes would say, sure, absolutely, that's good evidence that the real world exists. Berkeley would say, yeah, that's pretty good evidence that the real world exists. But their point again and again is, can you be certain? Perhaps there's the stability, the concurrence, the independent operation, just because there's a really good computer program that is really capable of holding this world together. If there is an evil genius who's all powerful and all evil, yeah, they can make us, again, think that the world is stable and people agree in their perceptions, if there are people outside of yourself. All right, again, so the point is that these thought experiments are not to be taken seriously in the sense of lived out, but taken seriously in the sense of challenging whether we can know something with absolute certainty. Okay, so let's then get to, we've talked about the challenges, we've talked about, why there might be reason to doubt, even though it's not, realistic that this is likely, but there's reason to doubt whether the outer world exists. And so Can we know anything with absolute certainty? That's the Cartesian questions that begins his meditation. And his answer eventually becomes, yes, we can know something with 100% certainty, something that cannot be doubted, something that is so true, so certain, that even if we are deceived about everything else, this one piece of knowledge cannot be doubted, even if there was an evil genius who is so powerful and wanting to manipulate us at every turn. What is this piece of knowledge? It's not 2 + 2 = 4, because that could be manipulated, our thought process could be warped, distorted, so on and so forth. He says, look, I know that I'm experiencing something. I don't know if that experience is real. I don't know if it points to something that's true, but I do know that I'm experiencing it. And so, even if there is an evil genius, even if there is a matrix computer-generated reality, the one thing I can be absolutely certain of is that I am experiencing it. Because if I didn't exist, then there would be no experience. If I didn't exist, the evil genius could not be tricking me, could not be deceiving me. So this leads to his very famous, one of the most famous philosophic phrases ever written. Probably the most famous philosophic phrase ever written. I think, therefore I am. In Latin, cogito ergo sum. The idea is that the only thing I can know with absolute certainty is that I think. If I am thinking, I can be certain that I exist. I can't be certain that I exist when I dream or anything like that, or when I become unconscious. Then maybe I vanish from existence forever. But so long as I am thinking, so long as I am perceiving, so long as I am experiencing, so long as I am feeling, because thinking in this Cartesian sense is a little bit broader. It refers to kind of all perception. So long as I am perceiving something, I know that I exist. The evil genius could be tricking me about everything else. The evil genius or the matrix could be deceiving me about having a real body. Could be deceiving me about my basic logical conclusions. Could be deceiving me about other people actually existing in the world. But the one thing I cannot be deceived about is that I exist because I perceive myself, because I think. That's what's absolutely certain. And so, we've achieved something that cannot be doubted. So that's very exciting, wonderful. And I think it's interesting to be able to read the Cartesian meditations, his thought process, a kind of a series of problems that result in a solution, that then generates another problem, that then generates another solution, that then generates another problem, until eventually he does get back to the real world. So Rachel's doesn't go into it in depth, and I'm not going to take a ton of time here, but to go from the absolute certainty, what we see is that the original problem is whether we can know anything with certainty, or whether everything can be doubted. The solution to that problem is I think, therefore I am. In other words, the one thing I cannot doubt and I can be absolutely certain about is that I exist. But then you're left with the problem of what we would call philosophically solipsism, the problem of being alone. I know that I exist. I don't know in what form, but I know that I exist. I don't know if other people exist. I mean, they could all be illusions made up by the evil genius in the Matrix. But I do know I exist. But can I know whether anything outside of me is actually real? And Descartes goes through this process. It's a longer process in the actual meditations, where he kind of evaluates a whole bunch of different ideas, and he comes to the conclusion that there's one idea that is really different in his mind, that is very different, and that is the notion of an all-perfect God. Yet he asks, how could an all-perfect God, this notion of complete and absolute perfection, exist within an imperfect being? I know I'm imperfect because I have doubts, I could be deceived. So how it is possible that from an imperfect being, a perfect idea, the idea of a perfect being, could exist? He says the only way that could exist is that it came from something perfect. It couldn't come from me. It couldn't come from something imperfect. This is one of the forms of the ontological argument. Another form of the ontological argument is to say, look, I have an idea of an absolutely perfect being. But I know that a being that exists only in my mind would not be as perfect as a being that exists outside of my mind, that exists independently. But the only idea of an all-perfect being that I have is associated with God. So therefore, how could I have an idea of an all-perfect being that only exists in my mind? Because if that was the case, it wouldn't be an all-perfect idea. And so it must exist in reality. Because the greatest thing that I can think of, the greatest perfection, is something that must exist in reality. And so Descartes gets back God. He says, all right, well, I know that I'm not the only one that exists, and I know that there is a God. And so that answers the problem of solipsism. But this generates another problem, and that's the problem of, essentially, how do we make errors at all? Because if a God exists, and this is a good, all perfect God, an all-loving God, wouldn't create reality where we'd be systematically deceived. So Descartes in that way gets back the idea that the real world exists. Because the only way that it wouldn't exist is if we were systematically, fundamentally deluded about our experience and manipulate it. But if there is an all-good, all-powerful God, which there must be, because that idea of an all-perfect, all-good God exists, then that God is going to prevent us from being kind of systematically deceived and put in error. But there's still the problem then of, well, we do make errors. There's things that we thought were true that turn out not to be true. And this is a problem that is very much akin to the problem in traditional theology of sin. How can an all-God, all-loving, all-powerful God create a world in which we sin, in which we harm each other, in which we hurt each other, in which there is evil? And the solution to both problems is pretty much the same. The solution to the problem of evil is that God gave us freedom, and we can misuse our freedom. We can choose to use our freedom in a way that God does not wish or approve. In the same way with Descartes, he says, look, and again, he's passionate about knowledge. This is what he lives for. And so for him, the problem of evil is an epistemological problem. It's the problem of, can we know? And he finds one thing he knows for certain, and then another thing with God. But then, for a guy passionate about knowledge, why do we make errors if there is this all-good, all-loving God? And his answer is essentially that our judgments, when we make a judgment, we oftentimes go beyond what the evidence or the logic warrants. We make conclusions that we're not justified in making because we have the freedom to draw these conclusions. And so we essentially choose to think poorly. That's what produces these errors. And if we thought only kind of in a strictly logical sense, in a methodological sense, in a disciplined sense, we would not make these errors. And the problem of evil, in this case the problem of error, would disappear. All right. And so that, again, is a very, very brief summary of how Descartes gets back certainty, how he gets back God, about how he gets back the real world. So the real world comes back after the end of Meditations 1, where everything is in doubt. And Rachel concludes the section of our reading that we looked at by saying, look, it seems like now complete certainty is unattainable. People have had problems with Descartes' position. They made arguments against it. And so it's not something that as human beings we can hope to attain. We're never going to be absolutely certain. But, Rachel argues, Descartes has made some lasting contributions here. So he identified the problem of radical doubt as a problem, as a philosophic issue that has to be addressed. And he showed how you can use the theological response. If you get to the idea that God exists, then this solves a lot of the epistemological problems. And it does make us ask, even if you don't accept his reasoning with regard to proving God, well, can we deal with this radical doubt? Can we respond to it in any way effectively without a theological vision and logic? And so that's where I'll leave you. I mean, if you don't have God, can you ever regain certainty about more than just you existing? Can you ever be certain that the real world exists and there's not an evil genius out there? And with that exciting kind of conclusion and question to dwell upon, I bid you adieu.